Hello, this is another episode of the podcast, and I cordially, such an unprofessional intro, chairs start creaking. Anyway, I cordially welcome you to the podcast. It's a pleasure to have you, indeed, and I think I'm going to start off with the lady that is pissing off everyone by the sound of it. The Duchess of Sussex is out and about again. And of course, this is something that is given way too much attention. And it's sort of like that person in your family who wants the attention and they know they're not going to get it by just being a good person or a person that someone cares about and as a result showers them with attention, or just a person who contributes to the family who is someone that you just want to be around, but they don't do it that way. They're like, you know what, I'm going to sort of rile up the situation and point fingers and kind of fuck up the family flow, and as a result kind of throw suspicion into the wind and also kind of throw everyone on their head by accusing them of being so and so and so and so, being in this case racist, or being rejecting her into the family, and being from a different color, and playing all the victim cards. And she's great at doing that, and she's just sort of leading the way for a generation of people who want to do that as a result. And if it's not the thing of being black or mixed race, then it's a thing of being a woman. If it's not a woman, it's a thing of being a single parent. All these various things. She's basically got her cards and all those cards nicely lined up, and she's kind of just dealing it out to the royal family. I'm not saying they're nice, or I don't even fucking know them, so who the hell am I to comment? But clearly, just as families go, she wanted to fucking... she knows that she has... And her husband, by the way, let's not fucking talk about him. Yeah, the little thing she's pulling by the nose or by the cock, whichever you want to think, along life, and just saying, it's your family. Yeah, I blame them for what you become, and you must blame them too. And what a fucking snitch he is. And let's use racism. Yeah, that's a good one. And let's fucking use everything and it's crazy that I'm not saying there isn't a thing that people don't of color aren't dealt a bad deal. Of course there are. Every day there are millions, billions. Indians face it, Pakistanis face it, depending on the country you're in, and there is racism within non-white countries as well. So anyway, that's a different issue for a different day. I'm not a sociologist, fucking talk to them. But with this particular situation and this silly shit is that she's just kind of annoying the fuck out of me, because I mean, when you can't, as I said, William and Kate fucking next in line, and their kids are next in line. So this one knows that. She's like, how do I fucking mess it up? Or rather, how do I draw the attention back to me? And how do I make sure this useless husband of mine, who I've convinced that needs to put me up on a pedestal and be a spineless little shit who I can whip around. Now I don't really care about him because I've got him whipped, and I don't really care about men who I can whip. I care about men who can stand up and believe in what they are, even if they tend to and choose to disagree with me. That's what makes relationships stronger. But no, we've got this little fucking shit who's got no spine, who's like, yeah, my grandmom hated me, my mom hated me, my mom died. Of course, there are situations which are make you feel like the victim, but then there are situations where you're put and you're encouraged to be the victim, and that's what she's doing. And he's like, yeah, your brother was a bigger brother than you, and he did more. And yeah, my daddy didn't love me, my brother doesn't love me. Yeah, I'm gonna renounce the throne, I'm gonna renounce the title, and run to America, where I'm going to use all the opportunities which this society is promoting right now to play all my cards out there and see how wronged I was. And as a result, I was so blind by this upbringing that I really, really was sort of oblivious to the fact that my wife was being treated so badly in this family. I'm going to leave the family, but I'm going to use what the family gave me to become more popular on other platforms, so my brother is not as popular and I'm as unpopular. It's just ridiculous what these fucking idiots are doing. And they're being applauded by other fucking idiots like this. So it's just idiots supporting other idiots. And it's crazy when I listen to her podcast, and she's got something on Spotify it's called archetypes or something. It just he sounds so fucking preachy, dude. Like, isn't it right, guys, when I'm wronged, aren't you all wrong? You are not them and they are not you. So first of all, don't act like everyone is as privileged as you. Now, fuck privilege, everyone. You're not a fucking normal person, a lady. You have a lot of shit going for you. So stop trying to get other people to fucking feel sympathy for you or even empathy, because you ain't that wronged in life. Yeah, everyone's got shit thrown at them. Pull up your socks and fucking stop whining, because you've got life pretty damn good. You got a lot of things coming your way. So play to those fucking things rather than making people feel like you're the victim and pouring in with sympathy because, oh my God, you're so fucking wronged. Jeez. It bothers me when people are encouraged to do what Meghan Markle's doing, because then they start, instead of saying, you know what, I'm going to fucking face life, take whatever challenges are thrown at me. Sometimes it's hard, sometimes it's easy, sometimes it's uplifting, sometimes it's demotivating, and sometimes it's just fucking hard. That's life. Instead of saying, I'm going to face it with what I've got, you're supposed to do what she's encouraging you to do, which is like, yeah, aren't we all wronged? Isn't it just so hard every situation? Fuck off. Yeah, made my peace, I think. Yeah, it'll come up in another episode. It keeps re-emerging. And yeah, more than her, she's annoying as fuck, but he's just even worse. And women like that claim that they want men like Harry, or Prince Harry, or whatever he's renounced his title, fucking Harry. And they think that, and the men fall for it. Like, they're like, yeah, I'm going to applaud this. I'm going to say yes. I'm going to be yes to everything because, you know, the women are wrong and I'm apologizing for being a man. And they think that's the way to get to a relationship with a woman, at least in the perceived idea of a modern 2022 woman. And then women really quickly realize that, fuck, what have I married? Just a piece of air filling this body that's going to just sort of mold and fold around everything I say and do. And they realize, that's not what anyone wants in a partner, man or woman. And the guy then realizes that he's got no fucking dignity and self-respect left because he sold it all for the right hashtags and the right kind of approval ratings from the opposite sex. And next thing, he's got no dignity. He's sitting at home just going, what else can I agree with, honey? And she's like, fuck off, I'm going to bang the trainer. And that's where life ends, in a beautiful pool of jizz. Yeah. Anyhow, before I go on and take away from today's conversation, my guest in today's episode is Mr. Bosco Anthony. Bosco is a digital media expert who helps people, companies, individuals, create a very interesting space for themselves using the power of storytelling on, well, the digital space, in the ether of the internet. In the world that isn't a world, but it really is a world that drives our world. It's two worlds that are more than one. It's a multiverse, it's a metaverse, it's so many things. And he's there and he helps people create a space, create a brand, create an identity, and create something that people can find them by, recognize them by, and a place and a face that can represent what they do best in the most, well, effective story. Besides that, we talk about what sort of shaped his life and his decisions that have brought him to what he's doing, from Tanzania all the way to Brisbane. He's had an interesting childhood, experiencing, well, as I said, like, different cultures, different kind of settings, and how those cultural contexts actually give you a sense of who you are, but at the same time give you a sense of not taking things for granted and just assuming, and how to kind of go to a new place and fit into that environment, as opposed to saying, the environment hates me, I'm just so always rejected. So what can you do as an individual to cope with change, cope with also geographical relocation, and also even creating a space for yourself online is something that involves resilience, involves sticking to your guns at points, agreeing and saying I'm wrong at other times, and being someone who appreciates other people's opinions, but at the same time doesn't just bend over and say, yeah, I'm always wrong, or the other extreme where I'm always right. So these kind of values which you grow up with help you in all sorts of change. And Bosco and I talk about that on today's episode, and we share our stories. So I'm sure you might, maybe most likely will, recognize a lot of the themes that we've discussed in today's episode. So I'm excited for you to listen to it, and as always, appreciate you tuning into this podcast. Until next episode, goodbye, God bless, take care of yourselves, my friend. Cheers. Catch you on the other side. Mr. Bosco Anthony, thank you so much for joining me and welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me as well.
Lovely. So let's dig into disruptive storytelling. But before that, you have sort of experienced perspectives from different cultures when it comes to either being born in Tanzania to living in British Columbia and now relocating to Australia. So just in that context, can you tell me how something as specific in your experience as social media, how it shaped up in these three, maybe the word maybe not distinct, but diverse cultural contexts? How has social media influenced and also evolved over the past few years in your experience?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think the best way to look at it is from the lens of past, present, future, right? So in
Mm-hmm.
Tanzania, you believed in storytelling in a very traditional aspect. You gathered around in the evenings and spent time with your loved ones, and you got the news through storytelling. You didn't really necessarily have the digital mediums. I was born in 1982.
Mm-hmm.
Social media wasn't really around at that point. So living in Tanzania up to when I was 18, I think when I was leaving Tanzania, you had the dial-up era of internet, and you
Mm-hmm.
sort of started to get used to what the internet was. And I still remember the beeping sounds that your dial-up internet made when you were using the internet.
And
But
then
of
someone
course,
would
when
pick
you
up the
came to
phone on the
Canada,
other end and you'd cut the connection.
yeah, exactly. And then when you got to Canada, that's when the fiber optic internet options got better and
Mm,
things started to progress a little bit more. But I spent most of my 20s and early 30s in Vancouver, Canada, and I think in my 30s and late 20s, that's when you went from the high fives and the ICQs and the MySpaces into actual Facebook back then, and
mm,
and Twitter and all the other platforms that started coming in. And I think at the time it was a novelty, it was a way of social life. And I think now in the last few years, especially at my time in Australia, people have become a lot more selective in what platform they're in, why they're there, what they're, there's a purpose for it. Some people will
mm.
be on Twitter because that's how they consume their news. And some people have gone off of it with recent events.
Yeah.
People on Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, TikTok, they're part of that micro video storytelling era right now where things are consumed in 30 seconds or less because either our attention is that of a goldfish or we've just decided to, take information in very small frameworks. So I
Yeah.
think I think the future of social right now is really, it's going in the direction of personalization.
Mm.
Like everything else, I think we're having issues with trust and privacy and what we choose to put out there and how we choose it. Recently we just got in Australia got hit by a cyber attack, with one of our healthcare systems as well, where most of our records were hacked. So I think
Okay.
as we move to this new era, I think there's going to be a little bit more emphasis on focus on trust and privacy.
That's a very interesting thing that it's almost come around, right? Where we wanted to be connected and also be recognized for who we are. And, that would be the creation of social profiles, right? Where you would put your best step forward and you would kind of have these descriptions and, be it from, Snapchat where you'd have these filters to Instagram stories where you would highlight your holidays or your workouts or your food or your diet and kind of to this place where you want to be more reserved and say, you know what, I don't want to, at the end of the day, share so much about myself. But
Yeah, I think you're right. I think,
yeah,
don't get me wrong, there's still people that showcase their holidays and their favorite meals and still
yeah,
have the throwback Thursdays. But there's a lot of us now, and it could also be a genre thing, right? Because now we're at an age where you've got the Gen Zs, you've got the millennials, you've got the baby boomers, you've got the
mm,
future gens as well, and everyone's looking at it in a different lens, and different people are on it for different reasons, I think. But I think we're driven by a common alignment of what our purpose should be, or what should it look like.
yeah,
And at the end of the day, I think what we've realized is that it really just comes down to where we are in life. and how we view what our privacy should look like. And I think, people still worry about the personification of advertising. You still hear people going, I was having a conversation about a Microsoft service and now I have Surface and now
Mm,
I've got all these ads hitting me up. Or,
mm,
I think you still having advertising ramping up. I think I read a statistic that said advertising spend on social media and digital is going to be up to $800 billion by 2026. So I don't think people are getting off these platforms. I don't think advertising is going to stop because it's how things are being amplified today, especially post COVID in the era now where more and more people are working from home. More and more people have identified that their purpose has evolved. And I think because of all of these different environmental situations, yeah, and global events, you're going to see different types of groups of people that will have commonalities, but also differences as well. And we're seeing a lot of that right now in the market.
Yeah, because when you mention the time sort of the time frame when you were growing up in Tanzania, and that is sort of similar, and not it's almost exact to the same years I grew up in India, like my formative years. I'm 82 born as well. So when you kind of hit the millennium, you moved to Canada, and similarly 3 4 years later I moved to the UK and then the US. So the reason is I'm bringing up that particular sort of time frame and comparison is because it, for me specifically, it had this impression of what the Western world is like, right? Whether it's with popular culture references or with media I was exposed to, or with a certain way of being or a certain way of viewing, and maybe even being in awe of Europeans or North Americans. There was this sense of needing to fit in, right? Like trying to
Mhm.
adopt those practices or cultural contexts, or speak in a certain way, or dress in a certain way, or party in a certain way. So, how was your? I wouldn't say cultural. I think, yeah, maybe cultural transition from a one is from a kind of dial-up internet Tanzania to a broadband Canada, for lack of a better terminology, to also maybe from you as a teenager or late teens, early sort of adulthood, into a Canadian context at such a pivotal movement, moment um, in that time, because a lot of things just kicked off, with the beginning of 2001. We saw a lot of rapid technological adopting, and a lot of all these new trends kicking in. So how was that phase for you?
Yeah, look, it was a massive culture shock, right? I mean,
Mm,
you got to remember that Tanzania, even though it was, Dar es Salaam, the capital stands for the haven of peace, and
mm,
Tanzania fairly internally was a peaceful country. We were impacted by the surrounding countries and what was going on politically. We had two presidents that came to sign a peace treaty, and on their way back, their planes were shot down, and it started the genocides in Rwanda and Burundi. And
mm,
in 95 we had the American embassy bombings, and we've had, Tanzania was going through a lot of changes. There was a lot of different things that we witnessed at home as well. We had our neighbor hanged. We saw violence at a very, very young age. And
right.
so we didn't realize that we sort of had some form of PTSD until we got to Canada, because at that point, we still had those recurring nightmares and dreams. So I think in
Mm,
Tanzania, our upbringing was a lot more sheltered in many ways. Our parents wanted to give us the best, but more importantly, also wanted to protect us to the point that
mm.
they might have overprotected us.
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
I think when you come to Canada and you start to see the liberal culture and you start to see different things, it's a different narrative. It's a different blend. You're going from from an Eastern sort of outlet to a Western culture. So yeah,
Yeah.
it was definitely a culture shock. It didn't really help that both the kids, my sister and I were both, teenagers at that point, and we wanted to sort of live and see life our own way. And we were exposed to a lot of different things as well that obviously kept our parents up at night, and obviously
Yeah.
allows our parents to worry a little bit. And then obviously you're at that age where you're in the nightclubs, you're at the bars, you're hanging out with people, and culturally those are different things that you were brought up with living in Tanzania under your parents' roof. So
Yeah.
yeah, it was a bit of a culture shock, but I think, I think for the most part we were lucky that we made right decisions, we hung out with the right people in the end, and I think kindness and a good upbringing really got us through that era of understanding who we are and finding our own identity over time. And
Mm.
obviously, when I moved to Australia as well, I think having immigrated to Canada, that really helped me because it gave me a playbook of an immigrant playbook, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
Most immigrants come
Yeah.
to a country, they want to get a house, they want to have a decent career, they want to look after their families, etc. So I think a lot of the lessons that I made and learned from Canada was able for me to accelerate that experience coming to Australia. Now, I think the internet in Canada is a lot faster than most Australians are willing to admit here. But at the end of the day, I think there's things that you love about a new place, and there's things that you miss about what home is, right? And for
Yeah.
me, I think there's always going to be elements of home through the people, the milestones, the food, the experiences, and the culture in Tanzania.
Mm.
But then you start to make your own new memories as you start to evolve as well. I think as technology has changed, as the environment has changed, as I would say the wars have changed as well from Africa to what's happening right now globally.
Yeah.
There are certain things that we're still connected to. We're connected to the emotion of human sentiment. We're connected to storytelling, regardless of
Mm.
what medium that story is being consumed on, whether it's your phone, your laptop, a TV screen, or you're sitting by a fireplace with your family and loved ones. The
Mm.
art of human connection through storytelling is still been an identity for us all. And it's
Mm.
still something that we can find commonalities and relations to, even if they're people that you connect with are in different parts of the world.
That's a very interesting thing, which is something I noticed when, especially I have family Indians who've migrated to the U.S. many years ago. Now their kids are first and second generation grandkids, Americans, and so when, say, my uncles and aunts left in the 1970s to the U.S., they kind of had this. Obviously, there's this. They have India, which they left behind, but they also had this India, which they froze in time for themselves. Where it was a certain way to be Indian, whether it was taking that particular context of Indianness to the US. So maybe they brought their kids up watching Bollywood movies or listening to bhajans or whatever it may be, right? That was their interpretation of what it meant to be Indian. And then I meet these cousins or meet these friends who are sort of contemporaries, and they end up being seeming more Indian than me because I grew up in an India. Of course, 1980s India, 1990s wasn't as sort of globalized in that way. The markets weren't as open. But then, the references, I would watch, movies from across the world, or I would listen to, rock, or I would listen to death metal, or whatever. So in some sense, I was kind of reaching out more to the world while they were reaching out more back to India. So
Yeah.
in context of storytelling, I find that fascinating that there is this thing when you leave a certain place, you kind of hold on tighter to what it meant to be in that place.
I
And
think
as
I
a
think so. I think so. I think
right?
you're right. I think we're driven and connected to nostalgia, right? I mean,
Mm.
look, I'm a lover of old movies. I love watching John Wayne flicks. I love watching
Mm.
war movies and Western flicks because that was a thing that my mom and dad and I did on the weekends. We'd sit
Yeah.
down and watch these old movies or Clint Eastwood movies.
Hmm.
And when I moved to Australia and I was locked out because technically, I moved here December 2019, and the world went into an apocalypse by February where
Yeah.
travel and the borders were shut down. And for a
Especially in
while there,
Australia. Yeah.
especially in Australia, we had some
Yeah.
strict rules. So I got through my weekends watching a lot of old movies, and so I was connected to nostalgia. I was driven by nostalgia, and it's one of those things where when I was homesick, my
Mm.
biggest way of feeling at home was reliving those memories. Whether it was learning a recipe that my mom and dad made and made it make something for myself, or watching something that I've seen maybe 100 times, but bringing back those childhood memories. That was how I coped through a time when we were in isolation and couldn't do much.
Mm.
But I've also had some perspective because I recently went back to Vancouver to see my folks and my sister and my nephew. I hadn't been home in over 3 years, close to three
Mm.
years.
Yeah.
And there used to be this little beach, that private little beach that I used to live by in North Vancouver.
Hmm.
And I spent a week in North Van and I was like, oh, I'm going to go hiking and then I'm going to go to this private beach that was literally right next to where I lived.
Yeah.
And I was really excited. I was psyched up. And I got to this beach after this hike. I was so happy to be there. And I was sitting there for 5 minutes. And within 30 seconds, I heard all this noise. And I turned around, and this beach was now having all these construction sites and these towers that were coming up. And you got to remember, I'd lived in this neighborhood for 12 years. It was quiet. The land was bought, but there was no construction. So I used to go to this private beach and enjoy the serenity of escape. And it was then when it hit me and I realized that time doesn't wait for anyone,
Mm.
and that was a perspective that was fairly morbid and sad for me because I realized very quickly that I was holding on to this memory of this beach and I was
Mm.
holding on to something that, for me was my young youth or my childhood. And when I finally got to relive that, all wasn't what it was, and it wasn't the same feeling, or it wasn't the same feeling of nostalgia. It was actual sadness because you realize how quickly the world is moving. You realize how quickly the world is growing. And you realize that, as time goes on, time doesn't wait for anyone. And we take time for granted, and so I think for anyone out there that does live those moments or is looking for those moments, my best advice is don't don't live for milestones. Don't say to yourself, if this happens, then I'll do this. If this happens, then I'll go back to my childhood. If this happens, then I'll achieve this. Because if that happens or doesn't happen, time doesn't wait for you. And I think that's the biggest lesson I've learned about life is we hold on to things in our hearts and in our memories. And sometimes that's all it is. It's only there in your heart and in your memories.
That's very true because you kind of get bogged down by that, um, by trying to recreate that, right? Like, for instance, when I think back of the little college town I studied in, I have such lovely memories, but at the same time, that same memory, or rather the same, at the same moment, you could have guilty feelings about how you behaved. And those things can either propel you forward with this recreation because you want to go back, and that's in some ways that's what reunions do, right? You have this thing where you go back to a school reunion and you have this expectation that everyone you studied with is the same person, but obviously not. So when you go with those
No.
expectations, and there's something there which is very interesting because it's the human experience, as you said, is you and it's great. I think each person deals with it their own way, but when you have this thing, especially say when it's beyond an individual and happens to a group of people, to preserve a certain way of what they perceive that their identity was or how their ancestors or their culture was represented. I'm saying historically, it's kind of manifesting now with this whole thing of people closing borders, becoming more about national pride, national identity. This is what it means to be Indian, or this is what it means to be Russian. That's when the problem arises, right? Because there is this thing that opens up where there's a lot of scope for manipulation, saying this, where other people tell you what they think you should do to represent your nation or your culture or your society best, right?
Yeah, and look, I mean, there's two parts of that conversation. You're absolutely right. I think people try to recreate that feeling and emotion. And even for me, there's some friends that I can, catch up with or pick up where I left off on, and
Mm.
everything is the same. And then there's some people you have a coffee with and you realize how you connected with them as a young kid isn't how you can connect with them now because life has happened or their priorities have changed or they themselves have a different identity as well.
Yeah.
But look, we're connected by our origin stories, I feel. But we're also living in a time right now where I don't classify myself an African, a Canadian, or an Australian. I consider myself a global citizen, and
Yeah.
so I'm fused by modern day culture that has different backgrounds. My mom has Irish roots and
Mm.
Indian roots. My dad has Portuguese roots. I was
Mm.
born in Tanzania. I moved to Canada. So I can't really classify myself as, country specific.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm driven by different countries for different reasons. And I think that, the more modernization that happens, the more globalization that happens, the more integration of society, and different types of people come together in relationships and procreate and everything else.
Yeah.
We're going to live in countries that don't really have an identity because it's being a blended identity moving
Yeah.
forward. And for some people that, in some countries they're embracing that, and for
Mm.
others they need to get adjusted to that sort of sentiment, right? If you look at cultures in general, if you think about the Indian culture, they have always been movers. You find
Mm.
traces of them in India, in Tanzania, in East Africa, in Canada. They've immigrated in different parts of the world.
Yeah.
If you think about the Somali community, that I grew up very close to, one of my best friends is a Somali. They were kicked out of Uganda and they ended
Mm.
up finding homes in Canada. And now they're some of the most successful entrepreneurs in that part of the world.
Hmm.
You have refugees in Africa that would move to Australia because they've had to.
Yeah.
I think circumstances have dictated culture. Circumstances and global events have dictated the movement of culture, and more importantly, that movement has created an impact. And I think that we're going to start to see a lot more normalcy of the different types of cultures. We're going to start to see a lot more acceptance of people moving and starting a new life for themselves. Um, you know, Even Australia back in the day, you know, love it or hate it, people were concerned about Australia back in the day because they felt that there was certain attitudes towards people from India or people of Indian descent moving to Australia because perhaps they were looked at differently. Now, some of the most entrepreneurial people in Australia come from an Indian background or come from an Indian culture. So I
Yeah.
think at the end of the day, I think we're living in a world right now where we're driven by choices that we make. We have a choice to be kind, we have a choice to accept people, we have a choice to be curious about people, we have a choice to welcome people, and it's less about stigma and it's more about human choices, individual choices. And I think kindness being a currency moving forward is going to be an important way of how we live life, or the
And
choice
that's
to be kind.
encouraging. Yeah, and that's an encouraging aspect of to hope for, right? Because what concerns me when I look at these situations is the flip side to that, which is the intolerance and also almost like the death throes of these certain groups that are resisting the acceptance of these multicultural, global kind of um, individuals, right? Who want to say, you know what, I don't really associate. Like, I mean, I'm very similar in that way when it comes to, yeah, I'm from Bangalore, India. I was born here. I am Indian in that way. But I don't, it's not like I have to do 10 things to prove that I'm Indian. It's in the sense I'm as happy going and living in Dublin or going and living in Cape Town, and I might hang out with Indians there, or I might not. I might hang out with. It's the idea which drives you beyond just the traits that you display, I feel, and that's, I think, what you've said, which is sort of resonates with me, because it's so amazing with social media. You can transcend boundaries, right? You can like how we earlier had pen friends, where you write a letter to someone you didn't know across the globe. Now you can do that instantly with instant messenger, or make
Yeah.
friends, or chat how we are chatting over this thing. It's fantastic. You don't need a visa to go to meet each other. But the flip side to that is that it's creating resistance from a group of people who don't want this to happen. And like, for instance, I want to ask you, when you with this perspective you have, which is traveling, moving to Canada, finding that set of things that helped you kind of imbibe the culture, and also kind of live in there, and then moving to Australia, and then you're hit by this lockdown, and especially a strict one when it comes to Australia. What did it do to your uh, for a person like you, who's traveled a lot, who loves traveling, who's also so global in his perspective? What was that treatment of individuals during the lockdown by the Australian government? What did that feel like for you?
Look, I mean, immigrating to a country is hard in any culture. Doesn't make a
Yeah.
difference which culture you come from. But immigrating to a country during a time when you have lockdowns
Mm.
is even harder, right?
Yeah.
Your mental psyche. At that point, it's not even the flag that you have or the passport that you have.
Yeah.
Anybody, regardless of which country you're in, whether you're an actor, a rich person, a person that's trying to make it in life, you're all going through those moments of isolation, sadness, depression, anxiety, not knowing. For me, my biggest challenge was not knowing when I could go back to see my folks, and
Yeah.
I knew that someday I could potentially travel. I just didn't know when. And my parents are at that age now where they're not in their, 40s or 50s. They're older. So for
Yeah.
me, my biggest concern and worry was more about, mom and dad and making sure that they were okay during this period of time. I think for me, my biggest mental struggle was mostly about the fact that I didn't know when I could travel again. And
Yeah.
so for me, that was a hard one for sure. And I'll admit that for me, that was, something that the unknown, the fear of the unknown really messed with my psyche. Having
Mm.
said that, I've come from a lot of adversity, a lot of challenges, and I've learned to be resilient from a very young age. My parents and my upbringing was you're not a victim. And no matter what situation happens, things happen for you, they're not happening to you. That was
Mm.
sort of a very early learning. Living in Africa as well, my sister was in the American embassy a few days before it blew up. We
Ouch.
passed it before it blew up on our way to school. So for us, we've always felt like we were the lucky ones moving to other countries and experiencing other things.
Mm.
And how I combated with people that had a difference of opinion was really knowledge, because you're not fighting racism. You're not fighting, someone's version of you isn't your reality.
Mm.
How I've learned how to deal with life. And so for me, I would say that having a non-victim mindset and saying to myself, that's their version of their reality. It's not your reality.
Mm.
Is allowed me to navigate through a lot of things in life as well. But the only person that has permission to really look at yourself and really tell you what you are and what your strengths and areas of opportunities are is yourself. It's not
Mm.
even your parents; it's who you are as a person. And
Yeah.
so, when you fight, when you fight with knowledge, you sort of silence the critics very quickly. And you have the power to absorb someone's criticism of you, or you have the power to deflect it. I think that's for me something that I learned at a very young age. Um, I was one of those people that moved to Canada just after 9/11, a few years after 9/11, and I incurred a lot of stereotypes because of that. I
Yeah.
traveled quite a bit to the US. I, saw things there as well. And I remember, this one time there was a man who was very angry, and I was about to jump on a ferry, and he said to me, "Oh, people of your kind, you come here and you take our jobs and you take our people and you do these things, and why don't you go back to where you came from?" And I remember I pulled out my AirPods, and I said to him, I said, "Where do you think I'm from?"
Mm.
And he had no answer. He just walked away, right?
Mm.
And so for me, it's interesting because I don't let those things affect me. I think, I'm driven by a different purpose in life, and
Mm.
I'm fortunate to have discovered my purpose in life. I even did a TED talk about how to find your purpose in life.
Yeah.
And so I think if you can accept that people are going to have impressions or perceptions of who you are, and that's okay, and that's not your reality. And as long as you can look at yourself and accept who you are, then really it's about navigating through these hurdles in life. But I think it's also about not feeling like you're a victim.
That's very important to understand, and and this is something which what you've spoken about, a couple of themes, things that have come up in these themes is resilience and not playing the victim card, right? And that's something which seems to be the opposite, which is playing out on social media. But before we get to that, and I want to talk about the whole idea of purpose because I think that's really important. But I want to quickly just go over the sense of, I'm not like a travel bug, like in the sense I don't, yearn to go backpacking kind of thing. But having said that, I remember when I was in college, living in university, I didn't really use a cane to walk around because I'm visually impaired. But I I used to kind of manage, right? I used to go through airports and make a fool of myself at times, going up an escalator that was coming down, and it's the motions of life, kind of a
Yeah.
teenager, a young adult who's like, you know what, I'm going to ignore the fact that I'm disabled, and I'm not going to show it because the ladies don't like to see a guy with a cane, is what I
If it's any
thought, right?
consolation, even people who are not visually impaired end up
Yeah,
doing the escalator the wrong direction, but usually that's because of the influence of alcohol for all
right.
different reasons.
I mean, if it's any consolation, again, is that I was under the influence and I couldn't see. So it's a double
Fair
whammy.
enough. Fair enough.
So
Fair enough.
the strange thing is, when you are going through those acts of traveling or living in a different country, there is a little bit of anxiety and there's a little bit of, you're reserved, you're kind of on edge, and you also miss your family, and it does something to you. And I don't know what, I can't put a term to it or a concept to it, but one thing which is very important, what travel does for me, is that it gives you context, and it reminds you of how small and insignificant you are in the larger scheme of the world. Because when you say live down, or sorry, settle down in one place for too long, or you're locked down in one place for too long, your worries and your surroundings tend to magnify and sort of amplify your worries. And sometimes those worries are petty, right? Whether, or it's like, oh, my neighbor plays the music too loudly, or something like that, or the person down the street, they seem to have they seem to have a grudge against me. So all those small things which you typically would say, you know what, it's fine, I'm just going to, as you said, use knowledge and say this person is coming from their context, that doesn't mean it's my reality. But as you spend more time, and this is something I'm drawing back to the lockdown, because I've noticed that about myself, is when I travel, I tend to let go and end up saying, you know what, let's just move on, let's let go of these things, because it's a bigger world out there. But when you are kind of in one place for too long, the smaller things tend to amplify in magnitude and in concern, in the scale of priority of concerns for you, right? Have you experienced that at all?
Oh, 100%. Look, I finally got to travel this year. And when I first started traveling for work, I remember flying into Sydney and watching the Opera House. And it was 7 or 8 years ago that I'd first been to Sydney.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember going, oh, I feel so grateful that I get to travel again. And,
Yeah.
4 flights into Sydney now, I'm like, I'm there for work, and
Ah.
Sydney still, you still love certain things about it, but you go, okay, it's now part of the routine. It's the same thing
Mm.
with flying to Melbourne after a few times, going to the same place, or coming back to Brisbane. Um, I think as humans, the grass is always greener on the other side. We're always yearning for things. We always want things. We're always striving to get somewhere. We're always trying to get somewhere. And sometimes we just need to sit back, exhale, and go, just soak it in. And I think
Mm.
that's the problem that we have right now with social media and this digital noise,
Mm.
is there's so much around us that we forget to just be in the moment.
Mm.
I am fortunate to have two British bulldogs
Mm.
who teach me a lot about presence. I
Mm.
work a lot, and they demand, attention. They demand times to take them for a walk. And they break my cycle of chaos
Mm.
to try to be at one with them. And I think that's a very important notion, is that, yes, we sometimes have tunnel vision. We create tunnel vision because of the way we live in society, or the routine of habits, and the lack of exposure to other societies and cultures. But when I travel, I've been a young traveler. I've been traveling for a very long time. And I've been in many places because I've spoken in different parts of the world. I try to absorb myself in the culture, whether it's going somewhere, sightseeing, trying to eat a local food, hanging out with
Mm.
people that might be from that place, because you tend to get a better perspective and appreciation of life. You
Yeah.
get to understand in a lens of how other people live life in other cultures. There's a book about, I think they call it the blue zones of happiness. And it was a survey about where some of the happiest people lived in the world. And
Mm.
funny enough, North America didn't really make it up the list because
Mm.
the Western way of living was, the rat race.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
and, you'd find some of these happy people that lived in the most, impoverished places in the world, or places where they didn't have to worry about retirement. They just lived for today. And I think COVID was a great example and a reminder to us as human beings that we are not as invincible as we think we are, where we are this little drop in the ocean, and there's a big world out there. But more importantly, it taught us that playbook, that rule book, that expectation, that society playbook that you're given, all of that went out the window when a pandemic hit, where everything that we considered the norm was chucked out the window, you know,
Yeah. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
we had to be embracing that loneliness, that solitude, that time with ourselves. And some people did really well with it, and some people didn't, right? So I think for us, that's a constant reminder that we're not as powerful as we think the human race is.
And that story which was sold to a lot of people and a lot of people around the world, and you mentioned America, and I just want to talk about that for a moment, is when the American way of life, which is bring work home, do these calls late at night, it's hustle, 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 and when that story proved to be a bit of a lie, I think a lot of people, as you said, couldn't cope with it, while a lot of people said, you know what, I'm going to move to another story and tell my own version of it, and
Yeah.
something which captures the American, so-called American dream. Of course, I've been there, have some friends there. There are a lot of good things about it, but the things that are captured and adopted by, say, a country like India now, is some of the unhealthy things that the American way of life, especially American way of work, is not really conducive to a more sustainable and more balanced way of life. But I was talking to a friend in the US, and I said, how's work going? And something he said, I said, he said, I'm very worried about the pandemic. I'm worried if I lose my job. I said, what will happen? And it wasn't that I'm not going to have somewhere to go every day or it's my income. His thing was, I'm not going to have insurance, health insurance. And that's such a statement that says if you aren't a productive member of society earning a salary with a job, you aren't going to have access to health. And that's
Yeah.
such a big thing, right? Like it's such a thing that you're only as worthy as the contribution you make to your job. Otherwise, you're not worth taking care of.
And that's changing too, right? I mean,
Mm.
I'm starting to do research for my next TED Talk. My first TED Talk was about how to live life with purpose. And
Yeah.
now I'm doing research on the future of work on a human equity scale.
Right.
And it's interesting because the research that I've done so far has taught me or showed me that the person that invented the 8-hour workday, the
Mm.
American 9 to 5 workday,
Yeah.
that concept came from the era of the industrial era,
Yeah.
during that industrial revolution. So someone in the 1800s decided that we as humans should work 5 days a week, 9 to 5 or 8 to 4, 10 hours a week, 10 hours a day
Yeah.
for 40 hours a week. And that notion has now stayed with us for over, what, 300 years. So if
And
you think
similarly, the
about it,
education system, right? Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And if you think about it, COVID has created a revolution. People don't want to commute to work. People can, in Australia and in Canada and the US, there's talent shortages, there's labor shortages, and it's taken a global pandemic for people to go, enough's enough. We don't want to spend an hour commuting to work and an hour going back home. We don't want to spend 2 hours doing that. We can do our job in 5 hours. Here's
Yeah.
the question: why do we have 60-minute meetings? Most
Yeah.
meetings should be 50 minutes,
Yeah.
but most of the time we're driven by this DNA that we have to make our day fit in 8 hours, and it validates who we are as an existence. But there's so
Yeah.
many people that can work for 3 or 4 hours. The average human is productive for 5 hours, and they can get most of their job done. I mean, obviously, some jobs don't require you to work an 8 hour day, but most jobs don't require you to work an 8 hour day. Some people want 4 days of work and have a longer weekend. Some people don't want to spend 2 hours in the commute cycle, and that's what the future of work is going to look like. The power isn't in employers anymore. You have all these
Yeah.
government offices and private offices that have offices in the city, and they don't know what to do with themselves because now nobody in their staff wants to go back to a Monday to Friday job. In the
And to
city,
add to
they
that, sorry for
yeah,
interrupting, but just to
yeah,
add to that, there's another thing of you're seen as more hardworking if you're at work longer, which is not
yeah.
the case, right? There's another
No,
social context. Like people are like, wow, he
yeah.
works so hard. He's from work from 6 in the morning to 10 in the night. What he's doing there, no one asks. But
Yeah, we've
yeah,
glamorized this
yeah,
I'm so busy and oh yeah, I'm good, but really busy.
yeah,
Busy is not a badge of validation anymore. It shouldn't
yeah.
be.
It shouldn't be.
This
Yeah,
is the problem. When in my first TED Talk, there was a default statement that so many people laughed at when I said, "Oh yeah, we say to people, I'm fine," and I gave a meaning of what the word fine means, which was very colorful. But my point is that was that slogan back then. But today, if you're saying you're busy, I travel. I've probably been on 9 trips, and I've got 3 more to go this year. But I have to catch myself sometimes because I end up going, "Oh yeah, I've been busy. I've just been traveling a bit." I've got to go, hang on a minute. That's not a badge that you want to wear. That's
yeah,
just what you do for work, right?
yeah,
And I think we have to change some of this default ways of living and working. And we're already seeing it. I think there's a revolution where people are starting to say to ourselves, we aren't going to settle for the norm. I went back to Vancouver and I went to my local burger joint that has been there for 23 years, and I love the
Mm.
Jamaican wings. I'm a person that loves my spices, so I'm having
Yeah.
my chicken wings and talking to the owner, and I go, "How's business?" And he's like, "Oh man, we can't find staff." And I go, "What's going on?" And they go,
Mm.
"Well, no one wants to live here because they can't afford to live here. So why would the staff choose to come and work at a minimum wage job
Mm.
at a restaurant when they can't even afford to live here and it'll take them an hour to commute to this restaurant to
Yeah.
work, right?" That's what we're going through right now. And it's one of the things about globalization. I was in Vancouver, and so many people my age in their 30s and 40s are priced out of affording a mortgage in some parts of these worlds,
Yeah.
specifically places that have had the Olympics, right?
Yeah.
So I think because of circumstances, because of what's happening with work and scheduling and mental wellness and real estate and society's pressures, you're going to see a new breed of generations. You're going to see people that are going to have side hustles. You're going to see people that are going to have multiple jobs and work less hours at a job. You're going to see people that want to work from home and maybe come into the city once a week. You're going to see people that, might move further out because they can't afford to live in their cities. And so
Yeah.
I think as employers and as leaders of today, we have to have empathy. We have to have empathy for the people that we work with. We have to have empathy for their needs. And we have to change the questions because right now we're living at an age where those questions need to change.
Yeah, I think that's important for people to break out of this idea that if I'm seen in a certain way, it means I'm a certain kind of person. It's very nice that that seen as busy thing is what a lot of us thrived for, right? Or even, sometimes people are like, "What do you do now?" I'm like, I do my podcast and I do an occasional show here and there. They're like, "Oh, are you busy with it?" I'm like, I feel hesitant to say that I work 3 hours, 4 hours a week, because
Yeah,
I enjoy it because it gives
yeah,
me so much time to to read, to spend time on things I like. But I'll give you a little example of this thing about seen as busy, right? So just after the entire the big chunk of the lockdown in 21, that was last year, my wife and I, we went to Goa, which is this beach town, and a lot of people who are from these cities, which you just mentioned, these people who are like, I'm done with 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, and typically tech jobs, right? So these guys, we went to a shack and we were surrounded by people who had these formal shirts on and board shorts on, right? And they were on their
yeah,
laptops. And what I found, okay, I found that fascinating in the sense that, wow, we can do this. We're sitting with a view of the ocean,
yeah,
with a beer maybe or a mocktail or whatever, and the ability to kind of contribute to your company or to your startup or
yeah,
whatever it may be. But what I found a little annoying is that a lot of the people, I mean, I wouldn't say all, I wouldn't say even a lot, I'd say quite a few of the people there were, they wanted to be seen in that light as, oh, I'm the techie on the beach. And they had like their music playing loudly without headphones, or if they were on a Skype call or whatever call, it was without headphones. So it was more about being seen in a certain way. They weren't really getting work done. So in my head, I was like, you can as easily sit at home, work for 2 hours, get your calls done, come and enjoy the beach. But they wanted to be seen as chilling on the
yeah.
beach working. Do you know what I mean? And
Yeah, and
that,
that's
yeah.
because social media has, unfortunately, that's the negative side of social media, right?
Mm,
So people, that's an influencer image, right? It's a
yeah, yeah.
persona that people chase after, for people that, they go, "Oh, I'm a digital nomad," or "I'm an influencer," and
Mm,
they're too busy living their life through the lens of their cell phones, right? And I
yeah,
think there's a lot of us that were sucked into that for a while, but then we kind of stopped and said, "Hang on a minute, this isn't who I am becoming," or I think we gauge life not by where we're going, but who we're becoming. And I feel like over time, our identity evolves, right? So even, and maybe it's just old age, I'm turning 40
yeah.
this year. So my
That's same
perspective
here.
on, yeah, my perspective on what digital influences impact me are very different from what they were, 5 or 4, 7 or 3 years ago. But a lot of people, unfortunately, have this glamorous lifestyle of what it should be.
Yeah.
And it's not that.
Mm,
People think, "Oh, you travel, so you must have a really great life." What people don't know is that you have to wake up really early sometimes to catch a flight. They don't make a flight for tall people like myself. Um, I still get harassed sometimes when I'm traveling. My
Mm.
luggage is constantly being moved around. Now I try to take as much carry-on luggage as I can.
Yeah.
You got flight delays, you got COVID,
Hotel
you got
food.
flus,
Yeah.
colds, theft, like the thing that people think that jet set lifestyle isn't that.
Yeah.
It's maybe 10% of that, and 90% is you trying to get somewhere safely, if that makes any
And
sense, and
stressing
in one
about it.
piece.
Yeah. Finding the right
Yeah.
cab, finding the right
Yeah, finding
connection.
the
Yeah.
right Uber ride or cab, or
Having
trying
a
to get
bad
somewhere
stomach
safe.
because of some food you ate at a bad
Yeah,
hotel.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
12 trips for me this year, I've been living in a suitcase,
Mm.
and there's only so much of that you can do. I miss a home cooked meal. I was on the Gold Coast. One of my friends is like, "Hey, let me invite you over for a home cooked meal," and I was very happy because
Yeah.
he's like, "Are you sure you don't want to do a restaurant?" I'm like, "No, man, I'd be happy with a home cooked meal
Yeah.
because I've
Yeah.
been eating at restaurants all year round." So
And it gets
I think
tiring. Even
it's
sleeping out
tiring.
of
It
hotel
does. It
beds, it
does.
feels really good to be at a 5 star, but after like the fourth trip, you're like, oh,
Yeah.
the air feels plastic.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I catch myself going, try not um, try not to judge yourself on either side, because you got to remember that 2 years ago you didn't have the opportunity to travel and you were craving it. Two
Yeah.
years
Yeah. Yeah.
ago you wanted to go back home, but after 5 weeks of being home, you're like, I'm ready to leave, right? It's that human DNA that nothing is ever good enough. It's always better on the other side. And unfortunately, that carries on with our expectations of how we live our job and how we live our work.
Yeah.
I am one of those people that can work anywhere in the world. I am one of those people that will, have my breakfast and check my emails, but I
Yeah.
will pick a headphone when I'm taking a call out of common courtesy. I will try to find a quiet area to take a call out of common courtesy, because I realize that not everyone is in that same boat as myself, right? But I
Mm,
think it's
mm.
about perspective
Yeah.
and also not being so self-centered. The biggest impact about social media is it's created millions of people that can be self-centered or really not aware of the environment or the people around them. And it's unfortunate downside of digital storytelling is that it's creating false narratives for people, and they buy into these false narratives, when that is not what that life is supposed to be.
And that's the biggest thing that annoyed me. I'm like, there are people like us who are on holiday and we don't want to hear about how your last quarter was or how much bonus you know what I mean? But
Yeah.
I think that's an interesting place to take this. This idea of storytelling is so powerful and it's so lovely, especially when I look around, when I hear. Sometimes I just sit in a crowded place, or say it's some place, maybe an airport or somewhere, or even at that shack, and I just listen, and maybe it's sometimes even construed as eavesdropping. May as well. And
Yeah. Or
but, I mean,
people
it's
watching.
harm. Yeah, exactly. And I listen, and because I have better hearing than most, I can kind of capture sometimes conversations. And my wife knows when it's that look in my face. She's like, "You got that look in your face. Stop listening to them." I'm like, "But it's just interesting." My head kind of
Yeah.
tilts, and I'm just like, like a dog that's heard a whistle.
Yeah.
And what happens as a result is that these stories are just these kind of instances show you how unique a story each person has if they actually look within and find their own story. But I want you to just talk about how social media, because that's a place where you spend a lot of your expertise and help people shape stories, or rather express their stories in more compelling ways. Has it, because we've kind of covered the influencer space, all these things, has social media allowed people to express their true story, or has it told people to conform to a certain narrative and aspire to live someone else's story?
It's a really good question. I think it has the best answer is it has a bit of everything and a
Okay,
bit of both, if that makes
right.
any sense. So I think, I don't think when social media came out, there was a playbook on how to use it. It was
Mm,
sort of that new novelty that everybody basically got into. It's kind of like when we went from the typewriter days to when the first computer game, Solitaire and
mm,
Wolfenstein 3D and, Super Mario and Nintendo days, when we first got it. Some people abused it, some people did some innovative things with it. You're going to have human innovation, and curiosity motivates people on so many different levels.
yeah.
So because we had these technological advancements that are still happening today, you're going to have people making choices. Going back to that conversation about choices, you're going to have people that are going to make good choices, bad choices, and great choices. You
Yeah,
know what I
yeah,
mean? And then others are just questionable because you're like, yeah, I didn't see that coming.
yeah,
But that's a whole different Kanye West conversation, maybe for a different podcast. But when you think about it, right, we have all these different types of choices that are driven by good, bad choices that we make. And I think with social media, when it first came out, we were all trying to fit in and keeping up with the Joneses and trying to keep up with things. And you still have people that are still trying to do that, to
yeah.
conform to society. But you're also seeing a new generation of people that are going to be selective on what they put out there. They're going to be, we've gone through, people call Zoom fatigue. We've also gone
Mm,
through digital fatigue.
yeah.
I think for me this year, the highlight of this year for me was in the 12 trips that I have been around the world, or nine and going on 12.
Yeah.
I've got to meet people that I've connected with digitally, and now I've got to meet them in person.
Oh,
And
nice.
those connections were amazing, were
Yeah.
so powerful. I got to go home and see the folks and have some home cooked meals. And,
Yeah.
you know, you stop taking pictures because those experiences were the selfies that you wanted to experience. They weren't the digital
Mm.
selfies, if that makes any sense.
So the,
And
the
so
digital imprint has been reaffirmed by the physical interaction, right?
correct. And
Nice.
I think we've come full circle where it really, our emotional intelligence, if we allow ourselves to be emotionally intelligent, we go, hey, put down the phone and connect with that person. Take the time to actually, embrace those things. So I think the intellectual ability to know that we have to make the right choices has is now stronger than it's ever been,
Yeah.
because we've been through that fatigue, because we have a little bit more empathy. And that's not for everybody, because
Yeah.
everyone's going through life in a different pathway. I think
Yeah.
life is a collision of different matters coming together or moving away. Sometimes we're two ships sailing side by side, but we're in different directions, right? And so there's no right or wrong. I think there's just choices that we make, and those choices then allow us to either have some form of satisfaction, short term, long term, or just for the now. And I've had a lot of really good choices this year. Someone said to me, you know highlight your year. I would say this year for me was about really the right choices.
Mm.
And I think that really reflected in those moments when I got to experience things, experience the nostalgia that I still preserved inside of me in those moments. And
Yeah. Yeah.
the best part for me being a traveler was seeing people that I haven't seen in person, but I've connected with digitally for 2, 3 years, right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
there was a lot of really good things that came out of it. So, I think we're ambassadors of choices and change management in many ways, and change itself,
Yeah.
but it's the choices we make for that change.
That's really well said, because it is so important to also understand that you don't have to be at someone else's pace or someone else's path or at the stage of life. But I think just being aware that you are doing something because of a certain reason or a certain thing is, I think, in itself quite important, right? And that leads me to asking you this uh, about this particular thing called we call purpose, because it's so easy to kind of get carried away by the wrong idea, right? Even in that space, it's someone else's purpose you can start living when you're not aware. And you hear this quite often nowadays, people saying, I'm pursuing my passion, when it's sometimes just the cool thing to be said. It's like that guy with board shorts and a formal shirt. And by the way, that guy had his husky on a beach when it was 30 degrees out there. I'm like, this guy's a moron, dude. And he's like, no, he likes it. I've shaved his hair. I'm like, oh, you're such a fool. I mean, I was totally judging him, but I mean, I'm not like, an expert in dog breeds, but I just don't think a Siberian Husky should belong on the beach.
Not at that time of the weather as well. So
Sorry.
that's torture.
Yeah, yeah. So, Bosco, let me ask you this idea of living your life to a certain purpose. Um, I wouldn't ask you how does one go about it, because I feel that's too simple, or rather, it's too, I wouldn't say easy, but what are some of the ingredients? Like when you said you have a playbook for immigration, right? Like when you go to a place, the things you do to kind of fit in and kind of take in the culture more seamlessly. So maybe in that framework, how does one, or how did you recognize let's maybe start with you because
Yeah.
it's something which you quite kind of shaped quite clearly. Is how do you go about recognizing um, the thing that drives you and you eventually end up calling your purpose?
Look, it's interesting that you asked me this question because, I did a TED talk
Yeah,
explaining about purpose and how do you find your purpose.
yeah,
And what's interesting is, that TED talk now has had over 1 million views. And I wish I could
mm,
go back to the audience and say, actually, I've got a new ingredient and a new way of finding your purpose. Because
right, right,
for me, back then, it was about connecting your passion with your origin story and finding out what your roots were, because
hmm,
typically your passion lives in those areas.
right,
But as time has progressed, what I've learned is we have different passions, we have different origin stories, we have different current stories, we have different future stories.
yeah,
But purpose today is driven by the choices we make. And it's less about finding your purpose, it's about choosing your purpose today. That's more important because
nice,
of the way society is and because of the ways things are. I still get people that reach out to me every month asking for me to mentor them. I've got 300 paying clients that work with me, via Zoom to help me,
mm,
and I help them transform their businesses, work with them on their purpose, whether it's business or personal. I
yeah,
mentor people globally. And I can tell you that people make choices to live the way they want to live. So I get a lot of people that say, I feel stuck,
yeah,
or I've been doing the dead end job that I've been doing for the longest period of time and I'm not happy. I'm in a relationship, but I shouldn't be in this relationship, but I'm here because I've chosen to it. At the end of the day, you choose to be in that area. You choose to settle. You choose to be that way for whatever narrative that you tell yourself, good or bad. There's no right or wrong decision. It's the choices you make. What brought
right,
me to Australia was the choices that I made.
yeah,
And I think at the end of the day, everything else, the environment and all the other factors, is what inspires you to live that choice or validate that choice. I came to
mm,
Australia, I worked for a few agencies. Some of the agencies weren't the best cultures, and I tolerated a lot of things at the start of my time here, and
mm,
put up with bad behavior and bad culture because I was going through an immigrant cycle, and I was like, oh, I just need to get my immigrancy and I'll put up with this stuff.
yeah,
But then I was like, hang on a minute, you're telling people not to settle. You're teaching people not to settle, and now you're settling. So I
yeah,
got
yeah,
away from that scenario and I said, hang on, okay, I need to call myself out on this. And I walked away from that scenario. And then I ended up working with other people that have been, truly amazing in my life right now, where I work, how I work, the people I work with. They're people I trust. They're people that provide safety. They're people that encourage me to do the best version, live my best version career wise and personally. And I realized I needed to go through those bad moments to get to where I am today. But it's
mm,
those choices that I made that landed me here. You know what I mean? And I
yeah,
think there's no right or wrong decision. I think it's the choices that you make that you have to live with. If
yeah,
you're 57 years old and you recognize that you need to change your career, it's never too late.
yeah, yeah,
I mean, there are people that go, I wish I was a chef. I wish I could go back to cooking because that's what I love doing. My question is, why are you not doing it? And if your excuse is it doesn't pay enough, I'm too old, or anything else, you've allowed the choice and a narrative to play to that particular entity. You've said to yourself, I can't do it now because of this reason. You're justifying it. So finding your purpose is less about a formula. It's about really having an internal dialogue with yourself and choosing what you want to do. Because if you choose to put up with the same things and settle, then that's become your purpose. That's what you have decided to do. And you have to be okay with it. If you want to be a podcast host and work 4 or 5 hours a day, validating it isn't someone else's purpose. It's your choice that you make. And you know
yeah,
what? If you're happy with it, then that's no one can put a price tag on that.
yeah, yeah,
Coming to Australia has some amazing things that have happened, but there's a lot of sacrifices that I've had to make as well to be here. But that's a choice that I consciously made. So I think the framework really is, yeah, you can go down the route of fusing your passion and finding what your origin story is, and identifying what are the things that define you. Absolutely. For me, I had a really good support system. I had a mentor at a very young age that showed me how to empower people because he empowered me. and
yeah,
and when he empowered me, I remember that feeling of feeling so powerful. And I
yeah,
remember going, I really love this. And when he said to me this was his purpose to empower people, I was like, I really could relate to that, and that's how I picked my and chose my career, right? I my tagline today is empowering brands and empowering businesses and empowering people. And I try to work really hard to leave people better than I found them. But that didn't come by me, really having a playbook. That came from really me making a conscious choice. So I
Yeah.
think if I had to now give that same TED talk, what I would say differently would be, what are the choices are you making? What are the choices that are you making today that can you live with those choices? Or are you going to end up being 60, 71 day and regretting all the choices you made? Because really, life is a series of choices.
Nice, really nicely said. I think that's such an important thing to recognize, right? Making peace with the choices you make, because sometimes you look at, say, a person in your field who's really successful and you're envious, saying, why can't that be me? But we forget to look at what choices or what that person has been through to get there.
Yeah.
A lot of people are like, I want to be Elon Musk, but no one talks about the sacrifice. Like, even when you said being a person who travels a lot, you don't talk about the bad hotel food or like the travels or waking up at 4 in the morning, being stressed. You kind of just say, oh, I wish I could travel like him. So what you just said is so important to say, you know what, if you choose to do this, then that set of choices or that choice will result in a certain outcome or a certain way of
Yeah.
living. And you have to have that conversation with yourself, which is, I think, so important, and sometimes, and not sometimes, more often than not, goes undiscussed with yourself, right? You want that big dream without the set of choices that determine that dream.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And look, you're going to make choices you regret. You're going to
Yeah.
make choices that you might not be happy about, but that's okay as long as you can live with yourself and say, I'm okay with where I'm going and who I'm becoming and where I'm going. Then
Yeah.
ultimately, that's what you're entitled to. And I think that's the problem, right? Is that social media and technology has created these false personas
Mm.
of what things should look like. Because I see my favorite musician, or because I see my favorite sports athlete, or my favorite actor, or my influencer, or
Yeah.
because I watch, 10 hours of bulldog and puppy videos on Instagram,
Mm.
my life needs to be a certain way. But most of the time, what you're seeing is 5 seconds, 30 seconds at the most
Yeah.
in someone's life. You're not, a great example is, let's look at some of the people that have left us. Great example, Robin Williams,
Yeah.
one of the greatest comedians of all time,
Mm-hmm.
but he suffered with depression. He suffered with sadness.
Yeah.
I live vicariously through one of my favorite journalists has been Anthony Bourdain. I
Yeah.
used to
Yeah.
watch Anthony Bourdain's Parts Unknown when I was in Canada and
Mm.
moving to Australia. I would watch his show where every Sunday he would go to some other part of the world. He's been to Zanzibar, where I'm from. He's been to
Right.
these amazing parts of the world, and I got to learn so much about culture and experiences through his moments. But someone who is as venturous as him, and someone who was well loved, and someone who was known globally, was that one of the unhappiest man that lived, in silence with
Yeah.
this unhappiness. And whether it spiraled because he broke up with his partner, or a relationship that really just changed him, whatever his motivations were, um, that was a very sad moment for me, because I sat there and went, oh my gosh, like someone who I loved and adored wasn't happy, and we didn't see it in society because we choose to live in silence. We choose to keep that unhappiness. We choose to settle. So I think if you ask me today that, how do you define your purpose? It really comes down to what you decide to choose.
Nice. No, I'm just letting that soak in, because it's kind of just reflecting on what I've decided and chosen over the past 3 years. And sometimes it's about letting go of a certain way of
Yeah.
doing things. And, I was so attached to the idea of being a comedian and the identity that gave me. Like, oh, you know what, I'm a comedian. And just the idea of that not being there in my life was terrifying. But, once you make
Yeah.
the choice, that's the thing of setting it free, right? Because you're not bound anymore by that definition,
Yeah.
that identity, that label, or that place where you feel that you belong. But you think, oh my God, if that's taken away from me, what am I? But you very soon
Yeah.
realize that you are a lot more when that's taken away from you.
And you know what? You're going to have moments where you're going to be tested. You're going to have moments where things are going to be taken away from you. So I'll give you a great example.
Yeah.
I'm a I'm a speaker, right? I'm an
Yeah.
international speaker. I've had the fortune of doing a TEDx talk, which, if you've ever done a TEDx talk back then, it was like winning an Oscar. If you were an actor or speaker,
Yeah.
that's sort
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
your permission to travel around the world and get paid to speak and everything else.
Yeah.
And I was fortunate that I spoke on a topic, even though I was a digital strategist and I did a lot of talks about digital marketing and strategy. I did a talk that was a human talk about discovering your purpose. And that created the spiral effect of traveling. So in 2016, I got off stage. I had put in probably, I want to say, about 380 hours of preparation for 18 minutes, right? So
Yeah.
for 18 minutes on this red dot, I spent 380 hours, 22 scripts, 20 dress rehearsals, and a whole lot of anxiety and
Yeah.
stress to do this thing. And it changed my world. And I remember someone saying to me, my mentor saying to me, soak it all in, because when it's done and you get off stage, you're going to say to yourself, now what? And it was
Mm.
funny because I got off stage and I was like, what do I do next?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
anyways, I started speaking. TED Talk took me around the world. I was being paid to speak, and I was doing
Mm.
about 30 events around the world.
Mm.
And then all of a sudden, COVID hit.
Yeah.
And the one thing that you validated that you could do around the world, your superpower, all of a sudden you couldn't do it anymore. You could do it through Zoom. And it wasn't the same experience
Yeah.
because there wasn't a live crowd. It was very awkward doing those things. And I remember going, oh my God, I don't know if I'll ever speak again. I don't know if I'll ever have the ability to speak again. And I
Yeah.
sat there and I went, that's the power of your superpower being taken away from you. And you have to reinvent yourself.
Yeah.
Right. And that's what I had to do. I had to go, right, what do I do next? How do I reinvent myself? How do I still take my purpose and blend it and do something different? That went into podcasting and digital webinars and presentations and, changing the way I did things, but having some of those core, identities. And as time went along, I started to speak again and the stage opened up again. I just came back from a keynote on the Gold Coast. I just spoke in front of 1,800 people. And I realized that at the end of the day, you're going to be tested. Your superpowers are going to be challenging. You're going to have to learn to be resilient and you're going to have to learn to be patient and you're going to have to learn to say, this isn't happening to me, it's happening for me, and to accept
Mm.
it. And the minute you let go of that anxiety and the minute you let go of that pain and you say to yourself, whatever the universe has planned, this is what it's planned for. I just need to go with it. The quicker you move on from things, the quicker you adapt from things. If I had to if I had to go back in time and give myself some advice, I would say it's going to be okay. It'll take you 3 hours, 3 years to go back to Canada. It will take you 3 years to get back on stage. It'll take you 3 years to go back to doing the things that you love, but it will happen at some point. I probably might have done things a bit differently, right? Because
Mm.
again, hindsight is 2020.
Yeah.
So I think for me, I think the challenge that we do is we already have too many pressures from society. We already have too many pressures from our family and our upbringings and people around us. We need to be kind to ourselves and we need to go back and say, hey, it's going to be okay.
Nice. That's really, I think, important and really nicely said. And well, Bosco, thank you so much for sharing everything you have. But I want to ask you one thing. You are a person who helps people create digital stories and tell stories about themselves. And before we wind up today, I want to ask you. Maybe you want to go out on a limb here, just talk about what Mr. Musk is up to with Twitter, because I'm fascinated, but at the same time, I want to get someone who's quite immersed in this technology and the platforms to tell me about. Is what he's doing or rather the future of Twitter, is that something which is encouraging for people who use the platform, or is it like what maybe the media is portraying as a dick move by a really rich man?
Yeah, look, I mean, you can compare it with a bunch of things.
Yeah,
During the Trump era, there was a moment in time where Trump was very vocal on Twitter, and then
yeah,
he got kicked out.
yeah,
You think about the recent Kanye West. You think
yeah.
about Elon Musk. Look, at the end of the day, the way I look at it is that platforms come and go.
Mm,
CEOs come and go. Companies get acquired and come and go. There's plenty of options for people to express their creative choices and freedoms, whatever his motivations are, whether it's disruptive, whether it's him trying to seek attention. You know, at the end of the day, storytelling is driven by emotion and sentiment. And as long as those human emotions still exist today, whether it's on Twitter or some other place, whether it's Mastodon or all these other platforms that are emerging, you're still going to have people that chase that sentiment. I was recently watching a documentary, and it was called, I think it was FIFA Uncovered. It was about the
yeah,
FIFA World Cup, So as we all know, the FIFA World Cup's
In
happening
Qatar.
in Qatar.
Yeah, yeah.
And if you haven't watched this on Netflix, highly recommend you watch it. 4 episodes.
Mm.
I binged watched it in 2 days.
Yeah.
I'm a big soccer fan. Now,
Okay, right.
like millions of people around the world, there's 4 billion people that follow the sport. We first had soccer when we were kids. You played with your sandals. You couldn't afford the shoes. You played on the,
Yeah.
the dirty
Bare feet.
ground, and
Yeah, yeah.
and that's how you grew up. So your parents watched it, your grandpa watched it, your grandma watched it. That was just way of life. Now, FIFA has gone through a lot of changes. There's been a lot of corruption. There's been a lot of issues with human slavery. They're talking about the situation in Qatar, about where the workers came from in Nepal and how many people have died to make this World Cup happen. They talk about, all these different gentlemen's club that of people that were accepting bribes to decide where these World Cups would go through. It's a great documentary that gives you the evil side of FIFA,
Yeah.
right? But here's the thing. At the end of the day, human beings, the fans of soccer, will still make a choice to watch soccer.
Yeah.
There's billions of people that still make a choice to watch it despite the chaos, despite the corruption, despite the bad choices that other people make it. Because for us, it's not about the corruption. It's not about that. It's about following a sport that we grew up on. That's our created nostalgia that we are trying to preserve. Yes, we're not happy about it. Yes, we're not wanting to see that. Yes, we, do not condone human modern day slavery. And some people will boycott the World Cup, and some people will say we're still choosing to watch it or be a part of it
Mm.
because that's part of our childhood and that's part of something that we still want to preserve, right, as a human
Yeah.
society. At the end of the day, there's no right or wrong decisions. It's just choices we make. And
Mm.
so the reason why I'm using this as an example is you're going to have the nutcases in the world. You're going to have people that are the opinionated people. You are going to have people that are crying out for help,
Yeah.
that are not mentally well or emotionally well. And these things are just moments in time that shape our journey, and we navigate through that human collision. I think at the end of the day, regardless of whether it happens on Twitter, Facebook, if it happens on Snapchat or TikTok, every platform has its own issues. We have issues with privacy and advertising, but yet
Yeah.
we're still on there. We have issues with, our data being sold to other places, yet we're still on TikTok. There's so many different things that make us concerned, yet we choose, keyword here, we choose
Yeah.
to still be on there. And so I think at the end of the day, as long as you give humans the right to choose and the choices that they make, they're ultimately responsible for their own choices.
I want to ask you one last thing. Maybe you can just comment briefly on this. I'm intrigued to know what the future is for these platforms like Clubhouse, Fireside, and Wisdom, the audio-based platform, because I'm heavily into listening to, audiobooks and podcasts. But do these platforms even have do they hold a flame to the likes of Instagram and Twitter, these audio-based interactive platforms?
Look, you're going to have an emergence of two types of platforms. You're going to have an emergence of platforms not for the masses. You're going to have
Mm.
people that are going to be on platforms specifically for certain niches.
Mm-hmm.
You think about Clubhouse, it was endorsed by actors in Hollywood, and then it grew really quickly. And
Yeah.
in some ways, it's kind of maxed its peak. But
Yeah.
the people that are on there are people that want to have conversations and are okay with listening to audibles. You're going to still have audible search engines and personalized search engines in the future.
Yeah.
Technology is going to change, and you're going to have more and more emergence to those places. I think what's going to change is human behavior and how we consume stories and information and everything else.
Yeah.
So there's going to be room for experiments. There's going to be room for places to exist, and there's going to be places where things are going to change. I was reading the Facebook ad revenue, and
Yeah.
last quarter recorded the highest drop in history of ad revenue decreases because most people were just put off by those advertising opportunities, right? Like most of the time when I see an ad,
Yeah.
I don't even pay attention to it. I turn it off unless it's really something that I'm looking for. And then I go, hang on a minute, is my phone listening into my conversations, right?
Yeah.
So I think there's room for platforms. I think there's room for micro niches and masses. But I think what's going to happen is human behavior is going to change. And I think the future of human behavior is going to have elements of trust and privacy and, what is appropriate and what isn't appropriate. We're already seeing this right now with advertising and cookies, Apple iPhones,
Yeah.
all the new ads right now about privacy. If you don't want your tracking on an app, you can turn it off. if you don't want to give your email to subscribe to things, you can turn it off.
Yeah.
Most of us today are unsubscribing to email addresses more so than ever before.
Yeah.
So I think in many cases, trust has changed how we consume the news and the mediums that challenge it. And I think it's going to be a big challenge for the Instagrams and the Twitters and all these different platforms of today to keep up with the momentum of what privacy and trust means to consumers.
Mm.
But it also leaves room for people to come up with new innovation. If you think about the last recession in the US, Airbnb came out
Yeah.
of that. Uber
Yeah.
came out of that. So usually when there's struggle and diversity and challenges and people have to be resilient, some of the world's best innovation comes out during those times.
Well, that's encouraging, and we can hope for stuff that will bring us together and help us as a group of people going and trying to make sense of this. So, Bosco,
Yeah,
thank
I
you
want to
so.
leave you. I
Yeah.
want to leave you with a thought, though, right? I
Yeah.
mean, for the critics out there, maybe this is something that is a good way to end this segment and this interview. Do you remember the QR codes? And do you remember back in the day, people slammed the QR codes and said this would never work,
Yeah.
right? Meanwhile, in Japan, it was taken off. But in the US and in Canada, when the QR codes first came down, people were not big fans of it. I know
Yeah.
this because I worked in that space.
Yeah.
Well, all it took was a global pandemic for your grandma to start using the damn QR codes.
Yeah.
So at the end of the day, if you think about it, what's old sometimes becomes new again, and what gets criticized gets embraced. And so, as my grandma used to say, one man's meat is another man's poison, or one man's trash is another man's treasure.
Yeah.
I think the same can be said about platforms.
Fantastic, Bosco. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you taking the time and also sharing your nuggets of wisdom and your story and your life experiences. I really appreciate you being here.
Likewise, thank you for having me, and I look forward to seeing you again.
Thanks, Bosco. Take care.